Hello, I'm AdmiralBumblebee, and today I'm going to walk you through Oeksound Soothe. But before we do that, we're going to talk about the discrete Fourier transform. So let's start with a simple square wave here. What is a square wave? Well, what you first need to know is that a square wave and any signal actually breaks down into a composition of sine waves. If you've ever looked at an analyzer in your DAW, then surely you've seen this. You put a signal through it and you get a bunch of different peaks at different frequencies. These frequencies are actually the sine waves that would theoretically compose the signal that you're listening to. The FFT process spits out what are called bins. Each of these bins is a set of data that represents the amplitude of a certain range of frequencies. However, if you've ever used an analyzer, you will know that when you input just one sine wave, you get all sorts of noise off to the side. And this is due to something that is solved with what is called windowing. Let me take a quick break and explain to you why windowing is even necessary to begin with. So let's imagine that we have a variety of sine waves and we want to be able to recognize them. If we take them one sample at a time, they all look very similar. So we need to be able to take a large enough chunk that allows us to see a full period of the lowest frequency sine wave that we want to recognize. If you've ever played with the block size in one of your FFT analyzers, you would know that a larger size will allow you to see the lower frequencies in more detail. That's because a larger block size lets you see more time, which will allow you to see frequencies that take more time to happen, such as lower frequencies. But not all of our sine waves fit perfectly inside that block. Some of them will end or begin with their edges not meeting at the 0 points. So what the FFT sees is this block that looks kind of nasty like you see on the bottom. And as we learned before, anything that is not a single sine wave is composed of many sine waves. So those little discontinuities in our signal actually make the FFT think that there's many sine waves in the signal, even though it's just one. So our problem is that the edges of the captured signal don't end at 0. Alright, audio engineer, how do you fix that? Did you figure it out? The answer, of course, is you just fade the beginning and the end. If we look at our previous problems, when we fade out the beginning and the end, our resulting waveform looks a lot more sine-like. It's a lot more smooth. And this will mean that there are fewer harmonics generated when the FFT looks at it. Much like there are varying fade sizes in your DAW, there are different types of fades for window functions. So let's look at two common window functions: rectangular, which is the default window function when you do nothing at all, and Han, which is actually what Soothe uses. The main thing you'll notice is that the rectangular window has lots of noise off to the side. Those little bits are called side lobes. The Han window, as we demonstrated with its fading functions on the side, has fewer side lobes. Nothing is free though. If you compare the rectangular window to another window called the Kaiser window, you will see that the rectangular window has a very defined peak at the top, right in the middle of our main lobe. But in the Kaiser window, we have much lower side lobes, but our main peak is really wide. Nothing is for free, so you need to choose carefully. Let's rewind a bit and start thinking about time resolution instead of frequency resolution. Remember how we talked about the FFT grabbing things in blocks? Well, that means that we have to wait for those blocks to finish being analyzed before we can get any data back. With a 512 sample FFT block size and a 44,100 Hz sample rate, we would get data back about 86 times a second. That sounds pretty good if you're thinking about visual frame rates, but for audio, that's pretty terrible. But hey, we have a trick up our sleeve. Rather than just taking those blocks one after the other, we can continually take blocks in a fixed pattern. That way we can overlap the blocks that we get back. We can increase our frame rate by 4 times, 8 times, 16 times, as much as we want. If we had infinite computing power, we could have infinite time resolution. The image on your screen is showing a 4 times overlap, or a 75% overlap. If you pause and look at it, you can see why those names are what they are. This means that we get information back 4 times as quickly. Before, we were only getting information back about 86 times a second. Now we're getting information back 344 times a second. That's a lot better. So now that we... Okay, I'm sorry about that, but... Right, but you needed to know that this was possible before I explained how the plugin works. Okay, fine. As long as you understand that this plugin is technically sound and it really can do what it says that it could do. Okay, moving on. So, Soothe basically has a threshold, and only the audio, and specifically the frequencies that cross that threshold, are then reduced. So basically you have an ultra dynamic equalizer, and one that's very responsive as well. So let's go over what some of these parameters do. I'm running a square-like waveform through Soothe right now so you can see what's happening. The depth parameter is basically our threshold. The higher it goes, the more sensitive it becomes. Sharpness is basically the sharpness of the filters. You can see how they become very narrow as we go up and very wide as we go down. Stereo link means that stereo channels will either be treated independently at 0 or treated together at 100%. Wet lets us mix the effect in. Trim lets us change the output gain. Bypass bypasses the signal. Delta does something very cool. It lets us hear only what we're affecting rather than the resulting signal. So right now we would only be hearing these parts that the signal is affecting. That's pretty neat, and it's very helpful for tracking things down. Oversample, resolution, and selectivity we're going to treat a little bit separately. So let's look at this right-hand side. It looks like an EQ. It acts like an EQ. It has the same parameters as an EQ. So it must be an EQ, right? Internally, Soothe splits your input signal into 2 pathways. The detection signal, where it uses all its fancy tricks to figure out what it needs to do, and the processing signal, which is where it actually does the work. That equalizer section only works on the detection signal. It doesn't touch the signal that it's processed. So you can equalize the detection signal to have more emphasis in a specific area or have less emphasis in a specific area. It's just like having your own little depth control for every single frequency on the whole spectrum. Isn't that wonderful? To show you what the selectivity knob does, I ran a sine sweep through it and then recorded what the result was. With the selectivity at minimum, it's much more responsive at higher frequencies. With selectivity at max, it's not as responsive at high frequencies. So, why might it be doing this? The ear is actually more sensitive to some frequencies and less sensitive to other frequencies. This is called the Fletcher-Munson curve. The selectivity knob takes the Fletcher-Munson curve into account. By turning it to the left or to the right, you're making it more sensitive to what your ear is more sensitive to. Remember the FFT overlap that we talked about? It increases the temporal resolution for us. Well, that's what the resolution knob does. Normal is 4 times, high is 8 times, and ultra is 16 times. Please check out the text companion post for this though, because in my experiments, I found that the ultra and high modes weren't particularly useful some of the time. In fact, I would say most of the time. You really need to listen carefully to figure out if it's worth spending up to 4 times as much CPU for something that might not sound that much different. Oversampling improves the filter reduction, but once again, if you check the text companion posts, in my test I found that it really didn't matter that much, especially when it doubles or quadruples the amount of CPU power used. It does make a difference sometimes, but it's pretty rare. You need to use your ears. And now that I have your eyes used to that wonderful white background, I want to switch to talking about bypassing. This really bugs me in a lot of plugins, and Soothe doesn't do it right. As we discussed before, having sudden discontinuities at the edge of our audio is not good. And when you hit the host bypass, That's exactly what happens. The plugin just suddenly stops processing and boom, you get a little click nasty. Sorry about that, I got carried away. So Soothe and the host bypass look exactly the same in this spectrograph. We can see a lot of noise that happens as soon as we click the bypass on and off. That's not good. But you may ask, can you fix that? Yes you can. Here I have a plugin called Goodhertz Wow Control, which is a tape simulation sort of thing. It's a pretty complex plugin, so there's no cheating here. And you can see that when I bypass, it has a very nice, smooth fade out. It is a fast fade out, but it's smooth. It's click free and it's free. Please keep in mind that I am reviewing Soothe 1.2.0. So this complaint may have changed if you're watching this video in the future. I suggest checking and seeing if this has been rectified. Now it's time for some sound examples. In the first sound example is my voice. I have used Soothe on my voice for this entire video. I think it sounds pretty awesome. The next thing is a rock and roll bass guitar at 120 beats per minute. I'm going to bypass it slowly at first, and then increase the speed so you can start to hear the difference a little bit better. Isn't that native plugin bypass pop wonderful? I hope you love it as much as I do. Next, we'll go on to some drums. In this example, I have a pair of overheads with a center mic, and I purposely put one of the overheads very close to the hi-hat to make it a little bit more realistic to what you might find in a drum recording that gets sent into your studio, or perhaps something you did when you had a little too much fun before the recording session. So here we go. It's pretty amazing how well it tames the hi-hat without messing with the kick and the snare. I think it is an absolutely amazing tool for that purpose. Next, we're going to go on to some guitars, which I've purposely made sound pretty terrible. Here I have some guitar tracks that I made sound really fizzy and nasty and disgusting, and here we go. I think that's an amazing testimony. It sounds really good on those guitars. So now I'm going to switch back and forth between a mix with all the soothes on and a mix with all the soothes off. So how is the CPU usage? Well, I compared it to Melda's M equalizer, and it's not that bad. Soothe uses about 8 times as much CPU as M equalizer with 5 bands. And that may seem like a lot. Considering what it's doing, that is actually really impressive. And you're not going to be putting this on every single track in your project. Only things where you really need it. Things like voice or recorded drums possibly, and like I said, the oversampling and ultra options for the resolution, I'm not convinced that those are needed very frequently. So those numbers of needing 106 times the CPU, no. Don't even bother thinking about that. Soothe is really CPU efficient considering what it does. Would you like some mochi? Probably not. So, Soothe is a pretty awesome processor. It's the kind of thing that you won't use on every single track. In fact, you probably won't use it on every single project. In fact, you might not use it that often at all. But when you do use it, it is absolutely indispensable, and there's not really much out there that's that much better. If you have Isotope RX and you work with film dialogue, or you work with a lot of vocal sounds, singing, that sort of stuff, it is indispensable. It is amazing. You use it, it's great, you buy it. If you do anything, rock and roll sort of stuff, recording sort of stuff, it can be quite good. If you frequently work with tracks that aren't like super up to snuff, if you work with electronic music where you have a lot of control over your sounds, then you probably don't need it as much. Because it's the kind of thing that you fix stuff that is broken. And if you can fix stuff from the source, you don't need Soothe. So I strongly suggest you try out Soothe. I think it is worth the money. It is 149 euros for a lot of people. It's worth the time put into it. And I think for a lot of people, it is more than worth the money. So check out my Patreon at AdmiralBumblebee on Patreon. Check out my website, AdmiralBumblebee.com. Thank you. Good night. I'm going to eat my mochi.